Golic and Golic, which premieres in June on FanDuel Sports Network. It's Mike Golic Jr. joining us now on the Emerald Queen Casino Sportsbook Hotline. I loved Seattle's class. There were so many names to talk about. We have a young quarterback to talk about here, some really exciting defensive players. And I'm going to start with the draft, but we have a lot of ground to cover with you. What'd you make of Seattle's class as a whole? Were you happy with it?
Yeah, overall, really encouraged by it. I mean, listen, the way to my heart is always pretty easy. If you want to draft an offensive lineman in the first round of the draft, especially one from North Dakota State, I'm usually going to be pretty excited for you. But you mentioned it from the quarterback standpoint, too. We know this is a draft dominated by headlines around that position. And while so much of the focus is on the fall of Shedeur Sanders, I did always think Jalen Milroe's landing spot was going to be a really interesting one. And surprise, surprise, him landing in Seattle with all of that ability, all of that talent, and certainly some warts to his game becomes a fascinating subplot. I've heard Mike McDonald already speak on saying, you know, he's going to play him as a quarterback. There are going to be specific packages that try and make use of those abilities. And so I think with those as the headliners there, but top to bottom, this is a class that can fill in a lot of areas and really help Seattle this coming season.
Hey, Mike, can you think of any situation over the past, 15, 20 years where you have your quarterback, but you also have this type of athlete at that number 2 spot, and then you sprinkle them in there? I was trying to go back and just wrap my mind around it. I can't really think of anybody that was in that situation.
No, I mean, the closest I got, and I talked about this with somebody on draft night when he got picked, was I do remember now, they brought him in for a very different purpose, right? When Lamar Jackson got taken at the very end of the first round as the second first-round pick by the Baltimore Ravens, Joe Flacco was still the quarterback. And we remember we got all those fun stories about how Joe Flacco in practice, they'd bring Lamar in for like a weird package play with both of them on the field. And Joe's not even looking his way when it comes to that. And so there was that one situation. But outside of that, no, like the NFL, it usually isn't like college football where you've got a mobile quarterback that wears a number in like the 30s that you're going to put down in the red zone to try and offset your quarterback's lack of mobility. But but I think at the same time, it is also an admission that Jalen Milroe is kind of a unique case study, and he's such a uniquely gifted athlete that I said to anyone, once you got out of the first round, I'm kind of comfortable wherever you took him, and however you want to try and get those gifts on the field, I'm pretty comfortable with, because again, while him as a passer leaves some to be desired, and certainly it's still a work in progress, what he offers you as a runner is weapons grade. He is Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels-esque when it comes to the athletic ability on the ground.
I'm glad that you mentioned him as a unique case study, because I think very naturally here in Seattle, people start to look at 2012 and they go, well, wow, here's a moment of you paying this free agent to come in, gave him a big contract, it was considered a pretty big contract at the time, and then you brought in this young guy, third-round quarterback, and he surprises everyone. But I think that it does a disservice to both Sam Darnold and Jalen to compare them directly to Matt Flynn and Russ, when Russ felt like a more, I guess, NFL-ready passer. He was just shorter. And Darnold's so much better than Flynn was and has done more. That being said, Jalen brings so much to the table. I don't know. Were you also kind of making that comparison, or do you see them as two separate stories?
I think it's a very separate case. Now, what I will say is, and the credit to, Jalen, and one of the comparisons that I've seen from him, unsurprisingly, people went to the well on, was the other former Jalen from Alabama, and Jalen Hurts, and the fact that they are both passers that came with some question marks. But the other part with Jalen Milroe, and the reason why bringing him in the locker room is a very different conversation than one we were having in other areas, was, by all accounts, exemplary leader, a guy who really, through Alabama's transition from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer, did a lot for that team. Those attributes you'll love as a guy that's going to be around there to be in your quarterback room to help support Sam Darnold as they grow and learn. So I do see it as a very different situation, just because, to your point, I do not see Jalen Milroe as ready an NFL passer as Russ was coming out of Wisconsin years ago.
How much of an effect can one rookie offensive lineman have on an offense? I try to taper people's expectations with Zabel because, as you know, Mike, man, it takes 5, not just 1 on that offensive line. He can enhance it, but how much an effect do you think he really can have?
Oh, he can have a decent effect overall, especially as, a sign that Seattle is going to continue to invest in that interior in a way that maybe it's felt like hasn't been the case in a while. You've had some draft picks afforded to the perimeter, but the inside of that offensive line gave a lot of problems for the last few years. And so continuing to show that that's an area that's important to you, having a guy that comes in that is a really physical tone setter the way Grey Zabel is. We saw, through the postseason circuit, whether it was the Senior Bowl or in the lead up to the draft at the Combine, he's a guy that's got a lot of physical gifts, got a little bit of that nasty that you expect coming from that North Dakota State program. And so I'm not going to say it's going to be a wholesale change overnight. It's going to work in concert with some of the other changes on offense that should put an emphasis on that ground game and allow him to go out there and be a part of revitalizing that attack. So, no, I don't think one guy can turn the tides, especially on the interior, but it's about the message that it sends overall in the direction that this offense is hopefully going to go in 2025.
When you look around the NFC West, I would not blame anyone for favoring the Rams to win the division, no matter what any of the teams did in the draft, no matter their offseason additions. It's how the season ended, and the Rams didn't take a step back. That being said, I was a little surprised by seeing how many odds makers had the 49ers as clear favorites over Seattle. How do you see that kind of number 2 spot not shaking up, right? Because there's so much we still need to learn about these teams. But I guess, how do you see Seattle standing in this division?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that race for number 2 is a lot more neck and neck than odds makers would have it. San Francisco getting the benefit of what we've seen before, but I know I talked about it with you guys a lot last year. That's a team in transition. That's a team that took a lot of lumps this year. The core of that roster has been getting a lot older in certain places, and now we know the looming contract for Brock Purdy and the way that they're going to address that changes a ton of things. So, no, I look at what Seattle was able to do in year one, and then, the rest of the cavalry that we're talking about, in addition to the names we've already mentioned, like Nicky Manwari and the back end of a defense that already seemed to do so well last season, is an incredible value that they got in the second round here. Elijah Arroyo and what he can afford you in that passing attack to go along with some of the changes in that receiver room there certainly stand to help you. So you can go on and on down the list. Torrey Horton, another wide receiver that's going to try and offset that did a phenomenal job at Colorado State and had other people trying to pry him out of that school before he returned there last season. So all that is to say, I really think Seattle, based on the foundation they laid in year one, yeah, the offense is going to go with some pretty wholesale changes, but they're ones that probably lend you more towards a style of play that complements a defense that was the strength of your team last season. And so I do think that depending on who can kind of get their new guys up to speed earliest, San Francisco and Seattle both have a pretty good shot. The difference is, and the key factor that might give the 49ers a slight edge is, hey, you're not bringing in a new quarterback. Hey, you're not bringing in a new voice in his ear. Like having Kyle Shanahan and Brock Purdy able to go back to work together, that's a pretty important factor in all of this. Meanwhile, you're going to have Sam Darnold in a new scenario with a new offensive voice, albeit one that he's got some familiarity with, but it's still a big leap that's got to happen at that most important position in particular.
The tight end room is getting crowded, Mike. It's getting crowded. You got Arroyo over there. And when I watched the film, it just looked like a younger, a bit better Noah Fant, right? The way his body moves is a bit slimmer.
Yep.
His flexibility is a bit better to me. What do they do if they do show up to camp and you have Arroyo, you have AJ, this young man, Nick, out of Minnesota is going to be there as well. You think Noah Fant could be on the chopping block, or do you feel like they need a veteran like that in the room?
No, I think especially for the kind of player Arroyo is, having someone there to kind of help bridge the gap for some of the parts of his game that need a little bit of fine-tuning, right? Intermediate route running. Blocking, while I think he is a little better than he gets credit for in terms of technique, willingness to stick his nose in there, just wasn't asked to do a ton of it in the version of the air raid that Miami ran last year. And so I do think having a veteran, to your point, that's got a kind of similar skill set in the room with him in Seattle and in Clint Kubiak's system, where you can see those guys having pretty important roles in the way that he likes to, run offense in the ways that we've seen before. I think there's room for two in there, and especially, again, while Arroyo being a second-round talent, not surprising, he is still a guy that's going to need a little bit of fine-tuning in the less explosive areas of his game and the more nuanced parts that we associate more with tight end play in the NFL than just being a downfield threat in the middle of the field. That certainly changes the math for a defense in an important way.
We have a Notre Dame guy added to this roster with Rylie Mills going there to add to some defensive depth and compete in the pass rush. Tell me a bit about Rylie.
Yeah, Rylie is a guy that developed a lot in his time at Notre Dame. Big, physically imposing guy. I remember I met him in person for the first time at an off-season event a couple of years ago, and the guy's arms are as big as my head. He is an absolute mountain of a man, and I thought the interior crew that Notre Dame had last year, as good as any in the country when they were both healthy, and certainly the injury unfortunate for Rylie, but really strong at the point of attack, long arm, able to bench press guys out and make plays in the backfield, a decent amount of pass rush wiggle. Like him landing in the same room as Leonard Williams, to me, really fortuitous for him. Great guy and kind of a great comp of what he could potentially be. Maybe not as dynamic of a pass rusher, but I think very similar styles, and a guy that he's going to benefit a lot from being in in that room and kind of mimic that style of play there. So it's certainly someone that I think can be a big factor when he gets healthy and gets back on the field. A lot of physical ability there, and I think still scratching the surface a bit on what he can be as a guy that affects you in both phases, defending the run and defending the pass.
Were you surprised with the approach of the Hawks this draft? I mean, 11 players drafted, 9 on offense, but then you look at their undrafted free agents, and there are a bunch of defensive players there. Me, Mike, I always say that you can find the more diamonds in the rough on the defensive side of the ball because it's such an athletic position. We see guys kind of emerge out of nowhere. Back to my question, do you think that were you surprised at their approach, and do you think that they'll find some of these defensive players with the undrafted situation?
Yeah, I mean, listen, we know Seattle's got during the best days, a pretty well-worn history of finding good players as undrafted guys or later in the draft on defense. And I think, too, that's just the side where you've got a little more in the way of the structure of who's going to be affecting the game on the field for you already. And so you can afford to work later in the draft, work after the draft on guys to supplement that versus an offense that you're kind of trying to really remake the identity of this year. There's a lot of big wholesale changes. And so adding more high-end talent to that, especially, along the lines of scrimmage with some of the playmakers that you're trying to add to Clint Kubiak's attack, I think overall the right approach given the question mark that side of the ball is going to be going into this year.